December 7th, 1941. 6:37 in the morning, Hawaiian time. Admiral Husband Kimmel is standing outside the headquarters building at Pearl Harbor when the first bombs fall, still holding a telephone receiver that has just delivered news of a Japanese submarine sinking near the harbor entrance. The receiver is in his hand. He does not put it down. He watches the first column of black smoke climb above Battleship Row, and a witness standing nearby will later recall that Kimmel's face went the color of his white uniform. Not pale exactly, but drained, as if the blood had simply decided to go somewhere else. 4,000 miles away, in a converted naval command post in Hiroshima Prefecture, Isoroku Yamamoto is playing shogi. This is not a dramatic invention. Multiple aides present that morning recorded it. The man who designed the attack on Pearl Harbor, who argued for it, who refined its logistics across months of planning, who staked his professional reputation and his personal honor on its execution. That man is sitting cross-legged on a tatami mat, pushing lacquered game pieces across a wooden board, waiting for news that his pilots have killed the American Pacific Fleet in its sleep. The attack is working. The first wave reports are extraordinary. Battleships burning, aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could respond, casualties in the thousands. By any tactical measure, the operation is a success of a kind rarely achieved in the history of naval warfare. Yamamoto does not celebrate. The aides who were there described him as quiet throughout the day, methodical, almost formal in the way he received each new report. When the final tallies came in, 8 battleships hit, 292 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans killed, he acknowledged the numbers and returned to his game. One aide, writing years afterward, said he could not understand it at the time. The operation had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. Why was the admiral not satisfied? The answer to that question had been forming in Yamamoto's mind for 16 years, since the autumn of 1925, when a 39-year-old naval officer had driven through the steel country of Pennsylvania in a rented automobile and looked out the window at something that changed the way he understood the future. What he saw there would eventually determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War, and almost no one in Tokyo was willing to hear it. Part 1. The Man Who Counted Everything. In 1925, Isoroku Yamamoto arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to study at Harvard University. He was not a student in the traditional sense. He was a mid-career naval officer, already 39 years old, already decorated, already missing the index and middle fingers of his left hand, taken by a Russian shell at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 when he was a 19-year-old ensign aboard the cruiser Nishin. He was in Cambridge to study English and, more broadly, to observe America. He observed it with unusual precision. He traveled extensively. He visited the oil fields of the American Southwest. He drove through the industrial regions of Pennsylvania and Ohio. He watched the steel mills. He read economic journals. He took notes in the careful, dense handwriting that his biographers would later describe as almost architectural in its structure. He was not a tourist. He was conducting what we would now call a strategic audit. What he found was not comforting. In 1924, the United States produced approximately 45 million tons of steel. Japan produced approximately 1.8 million tons. The ratio was roughly 25 to 1. American coal production in the same year was approximately 500 million tons. Japan's was approximately 33 million tons. American crude oil production was approximately 700 million barrels. Japan produced essentially none. It imported almost all of its petroleum, and the largest single source of that petroleum was the United States. Stop and hold those numbers. A country that imports its fuel from the country it is planning to fight. A country whose steel production is 1/25th of its enemies. A country whose entire industrial base could fit inside several American states with room to spare. Yamamoto did not find these numbers alarming in the way a panicked man finds something alarming. He found them clarifying. They told him something specific. Japan could win a short war. Japan could not win a long one. The entire strategic logic of any conflict with America had to rest on this single brutal constraint. Hit hard, hit fast, force a negotiated settlement before American industry mobilized. Because if American industry mobilized fully, Japan would eventually be ground into powder by arithmetic alone. He wrote about this in various forms for the next 15 years. In 1941, the Japanese Navy's total displacement, every warship, every carrier, every destroyer, was approximately 1.9 million tons. The United States Navy stood at approximately 1.3 million tons. Japan had a temporary numerical advantage in ships. In carrier aviation, Japan had the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The pilots who flew at Pearl Harbor had an average of 800 hours of flight time. Many had combat experience from the war in China. They were, by any measure, the finest carrier strike force on Earth, for approximately 6 months. That was Yamamoto's calculation. 6 months, perhaps a year, in which Japan could operate from a position of genuine military superiority. After that, the factories would speak. And here is the detail that makes this story so precise and so brutal. Yamamoto was not wrong about the factories. He was almost exactly right. The Battle of Midway, where Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single June day in 1942, came 6 months after Pearl Harbor, almost to the week. He had predicted his own war's turning point within a matter of days. The tragedy, and it is a genuine tragedy, not a rhetorical one, is that he predicted it, recorded it, argued against the war that would produce it, and then, when ordered to fight that war anyway, designed its opening blow with perfect professional competence. Part 2. The numbers that Tokyo refused to read. To understand why Yamamoto's warnings were ignored, you have to understand what the Japanese military establishment believed in 1941. And to understand that, you have to understand a concept the Japanese called Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. The idea that moral resolve, warrior culture, and spiritual intensity could overcome material disadvantage. This was not propaganda invented for public consumption. The senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy genuinely believed it. They had evidence, of a kind. At Tsushima in 1905, a Japanese fleet had destroyed a Russian fleet that was, on paper, roughly comparable in size. Japan had won that war against a European great power. The lesson absorbed was, fighting spirit overcomes material deficit. What that lesson omitted was that Russia in 1905 was not America in 1941. Russia had been a collapsing autocracy, fighting a war at the end of a 6,000-mile supply line. America in 1941 was the largest industrial economy in human history, operating on its home continent with a population of 132 million people and a gross national product approximately 10 times Japan's. The numbers were available. The Japanese Naval Ministry had economists. They had intelligence officers. They had trade statistics going back decades. The problem was not a lack of data. The problem was that the data was unwelcome, and in the Japanese institutional culture of that period, unwelcome conclusions were dangerous to voice. Yamamoto voiced them anyway. In a letter written in January of 1941, addressed to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa, Yamamoto laid out his position with remarkable directness. He wrote that a war with America and Britain would be a desperate one, that it could not be won in the long run, and that he hoped the government would reconsider its course. The letter was not a secret document. It was a formal communication from one senior officer to another. It had no effect. In the same period, Yamamoto made a more informal but equally documented statement to Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. When Konoe asked him directly whether Japan could defeat the United States in a war, Yamamoto said, and this is reconstructed from Konoe's own memoir published after the war, that he could give Japan a free run for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that, he said, he had no confidence whatsoever. 6 months, a year. Then nothing. Now look at what American industry was already doing in 1941, before Pearl Harbor had even happened. In September of 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt had signed the Two-Ocean Navy Act. The act authorized the construction of 135 new warships, including 7 battleships and 18 aircraft carriers. The total authorized tonnage was approximately 1.3 million tons, almost equal to the entire existing United States Navy, to be built and commissioned within 4 years. The act was passed not because America was at war, it was passed because American planners could read the situation in Europe and Asia and concluded that the existing fleet was insufficient. In other words, before Japan fired a single shot, America had already legislated the construction of a navy that would, by itself, exceed Japan's total naval strength. Think about what that means. Japan's entire strategic plan rested on achieving a position of naval superiority, forcing a negotiated peace, and consolidating control over the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia before America could respond. The Two-Ocean Navy Act made that plan mathematically impossible before the war even started. The ships authorized in September 1940 would begin entering service in 1943 and 1944, exactly the period when Japan needed American naval power to be limited, not expanding. Yamamoto knew about the Two-Ocean Navy Act. He would have been derelict not to know. He knew what it meant. He designed Pearl Harbor anyway, because once the decision for war was made at the political level, his professional duty was to give Japan the best possible opening. He was not designing a path to victory, he was designing a path to the best possible negotiating position before the mathematics caught up. Here is a figure who deserves to be named in this story because he represents the institutional failure that made Yamamoto's warnings irrelevant. Meet Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome. 48 years old in 1941, born in Aichi Prefecture, a graduate of the Naval Staff College and one of the most senior planning officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Fukudome was chief of the Operations Division of the Naval General Staff. He was, in other words, one of the primary architects of Japanese naval strategy. He was intelligent, experienced, and deeply committed to the concept of the decisive battle, the idea that Japan could win the war in a single fleet engagement, as it had at Tsushima. Fukudome was also the officer who, when presented with analyses of American industrial capacity, consistently filtered those analyses through the lens of what was strategically desirable rather than what was strategically true. He was not stupid. He was not corrupt. He was a product of a system that rewarded aggressive optimism and punished cautious realism. He survived the war. He was captured by Filipino guerrillas in 1944, rescued by Japanese forces, and continued in command until the end. He lived until 1971. In his post-war memoirs, he acknowledged that the industrial gap had been understood, but not fully integrated into planning assumptions. That sentence, understood but not fully integrated, is one of the most precise descriptions of institutional failure ever written by one of its perpetrators. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what the decision to fight America actually looked like from inside the Japanese High Command, not the mythology, not the propaganda, but the cold arithmetic that some men understood and said out loud and were ignored, press the like button. It helps keep this kind of forensic history in front of people who want the real account, not the comfortable one, and that matters. Part 3. 6 months of dominance. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 was, by any operational standard, a brilliant success. 183 aircraft in the first wave, 167 in the second, 8 American battleships hit, 4 sunk or capsized, 347 American aircraft destroyed or damaged on the ground, 2,403 Americans killed. Japanese losses, 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 men. The ratio of losses was staggering. In operational terms, it was almost a perfect strike. Yamamoto's plan had worked. But even as his staff celebrated, he identified the critical failure. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. The USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga were all at sea on December 7th. The attack had destroyed the battleships, the capital ships of the previous generation, but missed the carriers, the capital ships of the generation that would fight this war. He said so immediately. He was not consoled by the scale of the success. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces moved with a speed and coherence that stunned the Allied world. Malaya fell in 70 days. Singapore surrendered on February 15, 1942. 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops, the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Burma fell. The Japanese perimeter extended across an area larger than the continental United States. And in those same 6 months, American industry was doing something that had never been done before in the history of industrial warfare. In January of 1942, President Roosevelt addressed Congress and announced production targets that were, at the time, considered by many observers to be impossible. He called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. He called for 45,000 tanks in 1942 and 75,000 in 1943. He called for 20,000 anti-aircraft guns in 1942 and 35,000 in 1943. These numbers were not achieved exactly. In practice, American industry produced approximately 47,800 aircraft in 1942 and approximately 85,900 in 1943. The tank numbers were similarly large. The shipbuilding numbers were almost incomprehensible. In 1942 alone, American shipyards laid down more than 800 vessels. The Kaiser shipyards in California, using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques borrowed from the automobile industry, launched a Liberty cargo ship called the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes after the keel was laid. The average time to build the Liberty ship fell from 244 days in early 1941 to 42 days by late 1942. 42 days. Japan was building warships in months. America was building cargo ships in weeks. The logistics of war, the fuel, the food, the ammunition, the replacement parts, flow through cargo ships, not warships. Japan could sink American ships, it could not sink them faster than they were being built. Meet the man who understood this from the American side better than almost anyone else. Rear Admiral Ben Morrell. 47 years old in 1942, born in Salt Lake City, Utah, a civil engineer by training who had joined the Navy in 1917 and spent the interwar years building things, harbors, dry docks, naval stations. He was the chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks. He was not a combat officer, he was a builder. In December of 1941, he proposed the creation of what would become the Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees. Men who could build airstrips, harbors, and fuel depots directly behind the front lines, on islands that had been jungle 48 hours earlier. The Seabees would eventually number 260,000 men. They built 305 major shore installations, 2,558 pontoon causeways, and 589 pontoon barges. They paved 111,000 miles of road and laid 1,100 miles of pipeline. They built hospitals, fuel storage, ammunition depots, and the forward airstrips from which American aircraft would extend their range island by island across the Pacific. The Seabees were logistics made into military force. They were the physical embodiment of what Yamamoto had been warning about for 15 years. Morrell would retire as a full admiral in 1946. He died in 1978 at the age of 83. The machinery of American production was not just building weapons, it was building the infrastructure to use those weapons at the end of 10,000-mile supply lines. Japan had no equivalent. Japan did not have the steel, the fuel, the trained construction workers, or the industrial system to replicate what America was doing. And then came Midway. On June 4 through 7, 1942, 6 months and 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Combined Fleet and the United States Pacific Fleet met near Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific. Japan committed 4 fleet carriers: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. All 4 were sunk. 322 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 3,500 Japanese sailors and airmen were killed, including a large portion of the most experienced carrier aviators Japan possessed. America lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and 147 aircraft. Yamamoto had predicted the window. 6 months, perhaps a year. It was 6 months. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Yamamoto was not a prophet. He was not a man of unusual spiritual gifts. He was a man who had spent time in America, counted things, and done arithmetic that his colleagues refused to do. His warning was not mystical, it was empirical. It was built from steel production ratios, oil import dependencies, shipbuilding capacity figures, and the plain observable fact that the country he was proposing to fight had an economy roughly 10 times larger than his own. The question this investigation has been circling is not whether Yamamoto was right. He was right. The question is why being right made no difference. The answer is institutional. The Imperial Japanese military in 1941 was a system that could not process bad news through its formal decision-making structures. This was not unique to Japan. Institutions that have recently succeeded, and Japan had succeeded dramatically, defeating Russia in 1905, expanding into China, building the most powerful naval aviation force in Asia, tend to attribute their success to the qualities that define them. In Japan's case, warrior culture, national spirit, tactical excellence. They attribute failure to correctable errors, not to structural limitations. Yamamoto's warning was structurally impossible to absorb, because absorbing it fully would have required the Japanese military establishment to conclude that the war it was about to fight was unwinnable before it started. That conclusion was available. The data supported it. But no institution and no collection of individual human beings operating inside that institution can easily act on the conclusion that they are about to do something catastrophically self-destructive. The psychological cost is too high. So, they did not act on it. They acted instead on the 6 months. They took Yamamoto's window, his honest, carefully calculated estimate of Japan's period of genuine superiority, and treated it as a path to victory, rather than a warning about what came after. They heard 6 months of dominance and ignored the sentence that followed. And then we cannot win. This is the most precise and terrible irony of the entire Pacific War. Yamamoto gave his government 2 pieces of information. One was a warning, one was a plan. They discarded the warning and executed the plan with extraordinary competence. And the plan worked, exactly as designed, for exactly as long as Yamamoto said it would work. And then the factory spoke. In 1943, American shipyards launched more than 50 fleet and escort carriers. Japan launched 3. In 1944, American aircraft production reached 96,318 aircraft. Japan produced 28,180. By the summer of 1944, the United States had deployed 15 fleet carriers and approximately 900 carrier aircraft in the Pacific. Japan had 9 carriers and could crew them with approximately 450 pilots, most of them undertrained, with a fraction of the combat hours that their predecessors had possessed before Midway consumed the core of Japanese naval aviation. The ratio had inverted entirely. What had been a Japanese advantage of quality and experience in December 1941 had become, by June 1944, an American advantage of quality and experience, combined with a crushing and permanent American advantage of quantity. The pilots who flew at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of combat, American naval aviators shot down approximately 330 Japanese aircraft while losing 23 of their own, 14-1. That ratio is not a measure of Japanese cowardice or incompetence. Many of the Japanese pilots who died in those 2 days were brave and skilled. The ratio is a measure of what happens when one side has been training pilots for 6 months and the other side has been training them for 3 years, using an industrial system that can replace every lost aircraft within weeks. It is the arithmetic Yamamoto was doing in 1925, walking through the steel mills of Pennsylvania. Yamamoto himself did not live to see the full consequences of the arithmetic he had predicted. On April 18, 1943, 16 months after Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers intercepted and decoded a message detailing his inspection itinerary in the Solomon Islands. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters were dispatched from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, flying 550 miles at low altitude to avoid radar detection. They intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville at precisely the scheduled time. His aircraft was shot down. He was 59 years old. His body was found in the jungle, still strapped into his seat, his white-gloved hands gripping the hilt of his sword. The Americans who planned the mission, codenamed Operation Vengeance, had to seek explicit authorization from Navy Secretary Frank Knox and Admiral Chester Nimitz before proceeding. The concern was whether assassinating an enemy admiral was an appropriate act of war, or whether it violated some convention of military conduct. Nimitz authorized it. He said, in a formulation recorded by his staff, "Get Yamamoto." 2 words. The man who had spent 15 years warning his government about the sleeping giant was killed by an intelligence operation that demonstrated precisely the capability he had warned about. American industrial and technological systems, the code-breaking infrastructure, the long-range fighters, the logistical chain that kept Henderson Field operational, functioning at a level Japan could not match and could not disrupt. He had described his own death in the arithmetic. What Yamamoto left behind, beyond the operational record and the letters and the carefully documented warnings, is something worth sitting with for a moment. He was not a pacifist. He was not a man who refused to fight. He designed one of the most tactically successful naval strikes in history. He was a professional officer who executed his orders with complete competence. And he spent 15 years before those orders came telling the truth about what those orders would ultimately produce. That combination, professional execution and honest private assessment, is rarer than it sounds. Most institutions and most individuals inside those institutions resolve the tension between what they know and what they are required to do by adjusting what they know. They find reasons to believe the war will be short. They emphasize the tactical advantages and discount the structural constraints. They manage the gap between reality and requirement by editing reality. Yamamoto did not do that. He kept the gap open, clearly visible, carefully documented. He said, "We can have 6 months." He said, "After 6 months, I have no confidence whatsoever." And then he went and gave Japan the 6 months. The sleeping giant woke up, exactly as he said it would. The factories mobilized, exactly as he said they would. The arithmetic ran its course, exactly as he calculated it would, sitting in his cabin on the Nagato on the morning of December 7, 1941, while his staff officers celebrated around him and he did not. If this investigation gave you something, not just the dates and the carrier counts, but the specific shape of how a man can be completely right and completely ignored and then ordered to prove his own point, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most dangerous thing an institution can do is employ someone who is telling the truth and then make sure the truth doesn't change anything. Yamamoto was telling the truth. The empire he served was listening for something else. And on that quiet grey morning off Oahu, the giant opened its eyes.